Chapter 3. Eberhard. Eberhard Becker stood in the foyer to the suite of offices. He appeared oddly frisky, moving about, clutching several black and white glossy photographs in a game of keep away from his young law clerk. Greta was Eberhard's helper in the Rote Armee Fraktion cases, in which several Heidelberg students were charged with terrorism. They originally called themselves Das Sozialistischen Patientenkollektiv, after the psychological tags handed down to them by university health administrators. I think the name was supposed to be ironic, but maybe not. I was curious to see the photos that had Eberhard so stirred up. They were 8x10s of a naked police officer supine on a hospital autopsy table after a post-mortem laparotomy. The torso was sutured from pelvis to solar plexus. The prosecution had been required to turn over this document to Eberhard. Continuing the giddy game, Eberhard pulled the photos from my hand and began moving in a semicircle, shadowboxing. I went along, assuming a stance from my Philippine Kuntao class. Eberhard passed the sheaf of pictures to Greta, then launched a couple of jabs, dusting my chin. I was accustomed to sparring in a longapo with opponents careful not to injure one another. But in this excited state, Eberhard made me unsure. I slipped inside his left arm and darted my right hand in a downward motion onto the trapezius muscles running the length of Eberhard's left shoulder. The blow stuns momentarily, so that with the chop I could curl my hand in a continuing motion around the back of his neck. Without thinking what I was doing, but following a kata practiced hundreds of times, I pulled Eberhard's head forward and shot out my left elbow, which clipped his lower lip. Shit! Blood began to spurt. I quickly offered sincere, though doubtlessly suspect, apologies. Within 12 months, Eberhard himself was on the run from the Polizei for getting too cozy with his RAF clients. That evening I ran my deplorable encounter down to Janelle, who was already questioning the idea of hosting 2 ex-Marines at Thanksgiving. I'm sure Eberhard will be okay. He kind of enjoyed the whole thing. Made him part of the scene with that corpse on the table, I proposed. Rosenberg and Trecker, by the way, Trecker has a wife, Christina, plus a dog named Frog, who I think Christina refers to as Frog Person. They seemed all right. We'll have plenty of food. They call each other by nicknames. Steve Rosenberg is Tubby, like the character in the Little Lulu cartoon. Then Trecker, I think his middle name is Louis, but pronounced like the French king, Louis. And I guess because he's married to royalty, Christina is Princess. Janelle looked dubious. We'll see. In a few weeks, I'm going to Berlin. I got a call from a conscientious objector at the Air Force base at Tempelhof. That's where the Berlin airlift took place. He says he's a Catholic involved in glossolalia, speaking in tongues. His CO hearing is coming up. I explained how military regulations allow someone who becomes a CO, conscientious objector, after entering the service to be discharged. That is, if the hearing officer decides in his favor of sincerity. While I'm in Berlin, I'm also going to meet with the guys from Forward. They've had a GI newspaper there that's been coming out for the last 5 years. Wouldn't they kick somebody out publishing an underground newspaper if they had been at it for 5 years? Janelle asked. Probably, but I mean, the civilians in Berlin who are responsible, organizing the GIs. I'll be away 4 or 5 days. Maybe you can figure out something to do with your new American friend, Jackie. And what's your boy's name? Tristan? Where'd he get a name like that anyway? I don't know. Jackie's an opera singer, Janelle responded. Christina had been exclaiming for several days about her new 6-year-old pal, Tristan. Tristan, Janelle added, is obsessed with the Poseidon adventure, especially that scene where the ship's ballroom turns upside down. We had a full house for Thanksgiving dinner in 1972. Andy, our father of the PX card, was there. Max and June arrived carrying boxes of chocolate. Karen, whose pregnant belly was more protruding by the day, came with her manic-eyed boyfriend, Gerhard. Jackie plus Tristan stopped in accompanied by her husband, Richard Bukowski, no kin of the poet. And our newest acquaintances, Tubby, Louie, and the princess, found their way to Mittlerer Geisbergweg. Janelle plaited her hair in Chinese buns for the occasion. She looked beautiful that fall as the November air turned colder, wearing her wool-lined, embroidered Afghani coat with fringe of silvery fleece down its long lapels. Despite the tiny German oven, Janelle produced a robust bronze bird, and drippings turned into gravy over a sage and celery stuffing. We had real cranberries for a combination of sour sweetness and juicy meat, plus a miraculous pumpkin pie and American ice cream, again, courtesy of Andy. The meal also served as a welcoming for Bob Rivkin, whom I had seen once, but knew only as the author of the well-circulated paperback GI Rights and Army Justice. Rivkin had used his enlisted experience in Korea, where he served after graduating from Yale Law School, to explore the ironies and contradictions of military law. Our previous encounter had occurred 18 months earlier when we were on the same National Lawyers Guild program introducing San Francisco attorneys to court-martial defense. Bob misgauged the audience and opened his presentation reading excerpts from Catch-22. After a few paragraphs, someone declared loudly he wanted to be trained, not entertained. Yes, Bob recalled. I thought they could have lightened up. I maintain there is no excuse for losing a conscientious objector hearing. With proper preparation, a CO can readily survive the inane questions tossed at him by the most determinedly clever hearing officer. That is, what if Hitler were raping your grandmother is typical. I am opposed to participation in war. I'm not a total pacifist. Reasonable force used by police is not war and is therefore acceptable. This would be the thoroughly rehearsed answer. Nor have I reached my belief without serious consideration. I have read The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, was usually another. Having thus established what in law is termed a prima facie case, unless a major slip-up occurs, discharge is assured. Although this applicant's testimony about engaging in glossolalia, which I could not dissuade him from describing, was a new wrinkle, the hearing at Tempelhof was no exception. The People Putting Out Forward, longest-running GI publication in military history, took me in hand the day I arrived in Berlin. Dave Harris, a gnomic native of Michigan with an abiding tobacco habit, was the paper's leading persona. Sticking around after his own military discharge, Dave was already 10 years resident in Berlin by the early 1970s. Manfred Henschel, budding physicist, lent his name to the paper's legally required German Herausgeber. His arrest was also provided the test case needed to determine how close one could come to stand by the Kaserne entrance while distributing forward issues. I spent 3 nights in Berlin on this visit, sleeping in Manfred's commune near Wittenbergplatz. Today it's a chic neighborhood near the renowned department store Kaufhof des Westens. But in 1971, groschenless students and various dropouts could find cheap rents there. In post-war accounts, West Berlin is, quote, a city of young and old, close quote. The old stayed because it was the place they knew. The young came because, under the strange rules of the Allied occupation, they, the males that is, were immune from military conscription. The Russians may have lost the Berlin airlift, but they did not agree to have the young men of West Berlin drafted into the military forces confronting them. Under the same rationale, until the wall came down, all airplane pilots flying in and out of West Berlin had to be non-Germans. Occupation rules forbid German pilots from training for an invasion. West Berlin was a society without a middle, not counting, that is, the Turks, who numbered at least 100,000 by 1970 and performed a big chunk of the city's labor. West Berlin evolved into a legal lacuna, a real existierendes loophole, where even Americans could discover unrestricted ways of living. Harris, who became a Jugendberater, that is, city youth counselor, was one of them. Ronald, der Frosch, or Frog, no relation to Christina's pooch, Lafreniere, an ex-Marine Corps hustler and professional hat designer and maker, was another. Big Rich, a besetzer, that is, squatter, in the famous Ufa Fabrik, home of Germany's great pre-war cinema, helped found that commune's Vollkornbäckerei after playing saxophone in the Army's Berlin marching band. Odd birds, but for almost 10 years, 1967 to 1976, they formed the core, putting out Berlin's GI paper. In the Cold War's ultimate cul-de-sac blossomed a golden age of the GI movement. The trusty organizing tool of the era was to rally support for GIs facing court-martial. My own introduction to military justice began in 1968 in San Francisco with perhaps the greatest of them all, the Presidio 27, where mutiny was the charge. Organizers always faced a problem of inchoate politics, or garden variety prosecutions with blurry political contours. A drill sergeant could push a GI over the edge and wind up getting punched. Taking up the GI's cause would then dramatize bad living conditions or poor morale, but the situation might also be reversed. The GI confronting a court-martial could find safe harbor by linking up with the movement. In the end, no one really cared where the motivation originated. Following the conscious objector hearing, Harris introduced me to Dave Walter. In January or February, Walter was going before a court-martial at Andrews Barracks, quote, for assaulting an acting NCO, close quote, and disobedience of an officer, an order of an acting NCO. Two rather strange-sounding charges. Was Walter being singled out for some reason? Well, he wasn't known for being strack, that is, conforming to the spit and polish desired by the command. The allegations arose when the company executive officer, a lieutenant, left someone actually lower in rank, E3, private first class, ostensibly in charge over Walter, who was E4. For reasons not initially clear, the PFC had ordered Walter to remain in the hallway outside his room. Walter, according to the PFC, paid no attention to this directive and shoved his way past, thereby committing an assault. Yes, Spec 4 Walter did feel he was being singled out because the command saw him as an agitator. The incident, he thought, should never have been referred to court-martial. I had to admit, this seemed too petty to justify a trial. Harris told me the forward group wanted LMDC to defend Walter. I said I'd be happy to oblige. This meant returning to Berlin in a month. When I was back in Heidelberg, I ran into Rosenberg and Trecker, who told me they were going to Spain to get away from the cold descending on the Rhineland. I was slightly envious, but thought nothing more about their plans. Then, a few days later, rather animated, Trecker burst into the LMDC office. I need to talk to one of the German lawyers. The Polizei have Tubby and the princess, and I think they're on their way to search our apartment. What's this all about? I asked. Well, Chris drove to Patton Barracks to try to get shots and papers from the vet, so our dog could travel with us to Spain. She got stopped by the MPs, and she might have been afraid they'd find her with stuff from the PX, bought with my expired Marine ID. Tubby and I heard from Siggy at the apartment that Chris was being held by the MPs. We drove over to the MP station at Patton, and Chris rushed up to give me a hug. She whispered in my ear, "They're going to search the apartment." I couldn't quite hear too well, so I said, "What?" That's when the MPs said, "Don't let those guys leave." But Tubby split anyway. Slow down, I urged. What makes her so certain? They'll just confiscate the ID, won't they? Maybe, but we've got a pile of items in the apartment that German customs probably wants to check out. I went to Jürgen Laubscher to explain the situation. He brought Steve into his office, where he went over events once more. Max happened to walk in about then. Laubscher, inveterately calm, lit a Stuyvesant. "Let's call your apartment," he suggested. Rosenberg answered the phone. Indeed, Christina was there with the MPs, who had also brought along the German Zollamt, that is, customs officials. An inventory was underway. "I think we should go over there," I said. This is what any U.S. lawyer would do under the circumstances. I wasn't sure about Laubscher, but he agreed. Max needed no prodding. The rescue party consisted of Jürgen, Trecker, Rivkin, Max, and me. We covered the distance by car in less than 10 minutes. 2 Polizisten guarded the bottom of the apartment house stairwell. Whatever access to his clients an American lawyer might have expected, the German police weren't disposed to let us pass. Jürgen translated. "They say we can't go through because an investigation is in progress." "Well, we are lawyers, and they are our clients," I interjected. Rosenberg's head was partly visible through the doorway above us. "Hey, nice to see you guys. Won't they let you come up here?" Laubscher responded, "No, they say it's just an investigation. We can't be your attorneys because there's no case yet. No one has been arrested." Max contributed in full voice up the flight of steps. "Tell them to arrest you," lustily rolling the R's in the penultimate word. Laubscher looked in Max's direction, clenched his brow, and thrust his lower lip forward. We decided to retreat. That evening, the inventory was still going on. Evidently, the salt in the shaker was being counted grain by grain. The dedicated Solompt officials finally departed when Double Steve and the Princess agreed to sign a listing of suspected PX purchases. Christina could now recount her confrontation with the MPs. I panicked. She was unaware of the extra precautions at Patton after a Baader-Meinhof bombing in May had killed a sergeant, a captain, and a Spec 4. Tubby supplied his role in the burlesque. When I raced out of the MP shack, fortunately I saw Captain Anderson, one of the JAG lawyers I'm working with on a case. I told him I needed a ride. He was leery, but he drove over to our friend Siggy's house. I blew by Siggy's mom and grabbed the phone to call our apartment and got Siggy. I'm sure they're headed that way, I told her. I myself reached the apartment a couple of steps ahead of the CID and the Polizei. Siggy signaled me, everything's cool. Dan Turney, whom I hadn't even met yet, but who was staying with us for a few days, passed by me as he was going out to hide some hash on his motorcycle. Why didn't you take Mac's advice? I asked Rosenberg. Somehow I just didn't think it made sense. A Jew in Germany asking to be arrested by the Polizei, he replied. I couldn't respond when Janelle inquired why Louis went looking for a lawyer instead of staying with Christina when his wife was in the custody of the police. Later, Trekker told me, I thought it would be helpful to have someone on the outside. Nearly every day that late December, Stars and Stripes European edition, which we tried to read as often as possible, carried a story from Vietnam on what came to be known as the Christmas bombing. This was Henry Kissinger's sayonara to the war. Day after day, thousands of 2-ton bombs fell on Hanoi, even though Henry had recently worked out a peace deal in Paris with his Vietnamese counterpart, Le Duc Tho. The public, however, was in the dark. Many were upset. One was Regina Puston Fisher, Bobby Fischer's mom. The name Bobby Fischer was one of the best known that year, worldwide. In July 1972, Fischer played a series of matches promoted by the World Chess Championship in Reykjavik, Iceland. His opponent was the great Soviet master Boris Spassky. Millions followed the games on both sides of the ideological divide. In the Philippine Islands, my location at that time, men sat bare-legged in doorways, emulating move by move each freshly reported match. Bobby triumphed, and his mother saw an opportunity. Regina Puston Fisher was actually Dr. Puston Fisher. After turning 40, she had decided to study medicine. Because of her age, no American medical school would admit her. Undaunted, she gained entry to an East German medical school where she specialized in pediatrics. In the midst of Kissinger's mayhem, and over her son's vehement objection, Dr. Puston Fisher, a small gray-haired woman, made up her mind to protest. She started on the steps of the U.S. Embassy in London, where the British tabloids shouted, "White Knight versus Red Queen." Bobby was the knight and Regina the queen, in sympathy-matching colors. After the UK, Dr. Puston Fisher traveled to West Germany. She hoped to march in front of the court building where the Nuremberg Military Tribunal had condemned Hitler's deputies. En route, she stopped in Heidelberg to picket USAR headquarters. Max asked whether she could spend the night on our couch. I wanted to be outside the Patton gates at dawn, so all the people arriving in their cars will be able to see me and my sign, Regina said. motioning toward her hand-lettered sandwich board. Stop the mass murder. Bombing of Vietnam equals genocide. Janelle, concerned about the early cold, loaned her Moira's purplish crocheted cap. Max drove Dr. Puston Fisher to the gate at 5:30 a.m. Shortly, 4 MPs dragged her bodily away from the entrance. A chagrined Max missed the photo op because he was in a phone booth summoning Rivkin. Max dissuaded Regina from trying to repeat the performance for his camera. At 10 the same morning, she boarded the train for Nuremberg. I saw Regina 10 years later when she visited my office in San Francisco. By then in her 70s, she had just returned from treating children's illnesses in Nicaragua for the Sandinistas. She wanted to know whether I could help a Hungarian friend who had been underground in the U.S. since fighting against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. I used the overnight train from Frankfurt for my return to Berlin. Once across the East German line, I shared a compartment with a Czech guest worker, whose Bulgarian cigarettes gave me a crushing headache. In the dawn light, I felt my way from Bahnhof Zoo to Hermannplatz and Dave Harris's apartment on Weichselstrasse in Neukölln, near the wall. Over breakfast, he told me the reason Walter ignored the acting CO's direction to remain near his room. Dave's brother was rumored to be in the barracks. The CO thought Mark was selling hash and told Dave not to bring him into the caserne. I think Dave was out to warn his brother they were looking for him. Mark was a civilian who had more or less settled in Berlin, picking up occasional work, mostly pruning trees. I could see why his visits to the barracks created suspicion. Well, that puts a crimp in things, I said. My plan was to take a mocking stance toward the prosecution, showing the case to be an overreaction. But if Dave's motivation came to light, the strategy could backfire. One of the issues in the trial would be the acting NCO business. The power to give orders proceeds downward. Lower ranks take orders from higher. In addition, binding orders aren't possible between persons beneath the rank of non-commissioned officer. If Dave didn't know the PFC had the status of acting NCO, then he wouldn't have the intent needed for the violation. Second, had a legally sufficient order even been given? Did Dave understand it as such? Lastly, if it was a legally adequate order, could the trial counsel establish that Dave had refused it? One thing was certain: Forward would fill the courtroom. The paper, which echoed the name of Rosa Luxemburg's Social Democrat Vorwärts, had already printed articles building up Dave's case as an example of the brass attempting to squelch the enlisted man's voice. I had no objection to a full courtroom. Civilian lawyers believe an outside presence reminds the military that it's answerable to the larger society, even in distant Berlin. Making a travesty of an acting NCO lower in rank than the person allegedly disobeying his order wasn't the most difficult undertaking I'd faced in a court of law. But a military jury is not likely to go against the sanctity of an order, no matter how plausible its source. In a sense, the ludicrous situation eased deciding in favor of the order because the stakes were minimal. The lieutenant who had told the E3, "You're in charge," and sat him down at the desk near the door, testified succinctly. The acting NCO, now vested for the record with the necessary authority, described Walter passing his desk several times that evening. On cross-examination, he wasn't sure Dave knew about his newly exalted status, but he assumed he did, just because of where I was sitting. I objected to the witness's speculation, but the military judge denied my motion to strike. That would probably be enough for the jury members to impute knowledge to Dave. The acting NCO also related how he received word from the lieutenant at 7 that evening to restrict Walter to his room as soon as you see him again. He said he caught sight of Dave down the hall and yelled to him, but he just ignored me. Then he ran in my direction, and we kind of collided as he went past me out the door. I tried to block his way. I pointed out that no reference to any collision could be found in his typed statement to the military police taken shortly after the incident. No, he said, it didn't seem important at the time. That's what every witness says after a prosecutor decides something overlooked is important. Dave testified that he did not know the E3 was an acting NCO. Lots of people sit in that desk all the time when the sergeant is away. I had no idea what he was doing. He seemed all excited about something and was waving his arms. He was acting kind of loco, is what I thought. I went out the door because I was on my way to see some friends in Building 210. I never touched him, let alone collided. No one mentioned Mark's name. With pretrial motions and working out complex jury instructions regarding intent, the case consumed 2 days. Somewhere during that period, my manual for courts-martial disappeared. I figured I'd misplaced it. Later, in a lawsuit against the Army for spying on LMDC, pretrial discovery revealed that a soldier working for military intelligence stole it from me, a la Nixon's dirty tricks. I laughed when I heard this, since I'd failed to return the volume to the Mannheim JAG office 4 months earlier myself. Without troubling themselves too terribly, the military jury returned with a verdict finding Dave guilty of negligently failing to follow the order and not guilty of assault on an acting NCO. Walter was reduced 1 pay grade and placed on restriction for 30 days. I considered the outcome a solid victory. Dave said it was the shits.